You remember me. That voice is always weird. Do you guys hear the voice too? Yeah, that's new to Zoom, I think, this year. All right. So we're going to be talking about season extension here this morning, which is always a good topic to talk about. But I'm going to put a twist on it. We are going to be viewing season extension through the lens of a for-profit business operation. Now, we don't often talk about for-profit business operations here, but I like this twist because it makes it. Anything we talk about season extension wise that applies to for-profit can of course apply to a community farm or a homestead kind of level. But I like this just to kind of get you guys thinking about what a farmer has to think about when he or she thinks about season extension and the different techniques they're going to use. Because when a homesteader thinks about season extension, a homesteader is kind of viewing it through the lens of trying to extend your season in order to feed yourself through, or your family or your community throughout that entire season. Same with a community farm. You're trying to think about season extension techniques in order to keep produce in people's hands that need it. And also in order to generate cash flow for that community farm, often a non-profit operation. And all of that is very applicable to season extension techniques, but with a for-profit kind of lens too. And that's the lens we're going to view it through today. And I like to do that because we don't often talk enough here at Hayes Farm about that kind of for-profit farm and what that kind of perspective looks like. So that is our twist here. So we'll be talking about season extension techniques for a for-profit farm. But of course, all of these season extension techniques are applicable across the board. And to do so, we're going to be using a farm that's called Cookstown Greens. And David Kohlmeyer is the fella's name, and I mentioned his name a couple of times. He's a bit of a farming mentor to me. He retired from farming in 2014, 2015, and these here pictures were probably taken 2013, 2014-ish. So a little bit of time travel here. Cookstown Greens is still in operation. It is in the town of Cookstown, which is just south of Barrie, Ontario, near Lake Simcoe. And it is owned and operated by a fella named Simon French and the French family. So this here is David's operation, which is quite the operation, right? He had a 100-acre farm, which is what we're seeing here. I believe these here backfields, at least this backfield was his, probably both of these were his too. And then all of these front fields, some large greenhouses. Each of these greenhouses are about the size of our greenhouse, about 100 feet long and 25 feet wide. And what was interesting about this farm is nobody lives here year round. They have some seasonal housing on farm for where they used to house their migrant workers from Mexico. And everybody else lived off of farm, and they bought this 100-acre piece of land and developed it for 2 years before starting a farm here. So they were cover cropping and bringing in sheep manure for 2 years and just kind of remediating soil before they even started the operation here. David is a big fan of rotating his garden around. And that's a technique I was borrowing from him at Grassroot Organics as well. And so he only farms a quarter of this farm at a time. So 25 acres of the 100-acre farm. And then the rest of that acreage was just cover cropped until the following year. And he would rotate his garden around in that farm because you can grow quite a bit of vegetables in 25 acres. And then the rest of it was cover cropped, and in order to help with soil fertility, and we'll get into the importance of that, dealing with season extension, because we are here to talk about season extension and not just how brilliant David's farm was. Although speaking of brilliant, David has won some awards here too, so he's legit. He's won these different awards, and then he's also was a recipient of a Governor General Award and that's McCall there, I think her name is, former Governor General of Canada, and he received the Governor General Award for contributions to agriculture too. So he's quite the celebrated organic farmer. So this here, and so, okay, so here's another thing with the slideshow. David used to do this slideshow when I was teaching at Sir Sanford Fleming College. I used to get David in as a guest speaker, and he used to go through the slideshow. And then after 3 years of doing that, he was just like, Mark, you know the slideshow well enough, you can do it now. And so I do. And so he gave me permission to use all of his slides here. And so the first thing David starts with here is this here is what you're looking at is a solar tarping technique. And what he's using here is a reuse of old greenhouse plastic. You saw that he has those 4 large greenhouses. Well, every 6 to 8 years, depending on conditions, you got to replastic those greenhouses. And then so you end up with this a big pile of greenhouse plastic. And so he would reuse his greenhouse plastic by doing this solar tarping technique. Now, depends this year. So he was in Ontario, and depends where you're at. This solar tarping technique can be used, but differently, got to be tweaked for your conditions. So in Ontario, he got out here very early in the season. This would be like early April, perhaps. And he would dig in the solar tarp, much like the way we dig in the edges of our row cover. Big trenches, and this field would be wet at the time too. And you wouldn't be able to get machinery on here. So this was all hand done. And so he would put out this big solar tarp here, clear greenhouse plastic tarp is what it is. And then he would use this tarp to keep spring rains and any snow off of this land, because there was a gentle slope and it would all run off. And that would dry up this piece of land earlier. And then the heat that it would generate from being in greenhouse plastic would also help dry it out. And so he would put this solar tarp out in early April. And then by the end of April, he was able to plant in here in warmer, drier conditions than all of the rest of his farm and get an extra week or 2 out of his season. Now, an extra week or 2, right? That's a lot of work for an extra week or 2, right? However, again, from that financial for-profit point of view, if you're the first to market with a given crop by a week or 2 ahead of your competitors, you're going to be selling that crop first. You're going to get people used to buying that crop from you. And then when other people do have that crop in, people are already used to buying your excellent crop and they're going to come back to you. And being first to market pays dividends when you are a for-profit farmer. You also get to command the price. If there's nobody else at the market is selling your early beets or your early carrots or your early whatever you got, you get to set the price at basically whatever you want. I mean, within reason, of course, but it's very profitable to be the first to market. And so this is a technique in order to get into your fields just a couple of weeks earlier than you normally would be able to, is this greenhouse plastic tarping technique. So that's technique number 1 there from David. Now, I just got somebody here for CSA, so I'm gonna have to step out for a second. You guys can look at a picture of row cover here. I'll be right back. Right now I'm delivering an online, so I can't hang up too long. However, normally Claire would be here, but she just got a shot yesterday, so she's not feeling so good. So I'm covering both, so I'm just gonna grab some stuff out, and I'm gonna have to leave you on your own. this will be fine in future weeks. Claire will be here. I'll not always teach it online on Thursdays either. Just the way this works out. Yeah. Thanks, guys. All right, back at her. So technique number one, solar tarping to get in there early. Technique number two is row cover. Now the row cover, as you guys have already used and seen, in the early part of the season, it's usually enough to raise that soil temperature by about a degree or two. And again, a degree or two doesn't sound like much, but it's enough to, that is enough heat that could influence the germination of plants and also influence the growing of plants. And using row cover in the early part of the season will get your plants a little bit bigger, a little bit faster, more so again than your competitors at market and that aren't using it, say. Although a lot of people in organic market gardening are certainly using the row cover. So it's not that big of a secret, that's for sure. But it is a technique that will get you earlier crops and keep frost off of some things that are just a little bit sensitive to that too, enabling you to put them out just a little bit earlier. I won't spend too much time on row cover because you guys are pretty familiar with it. But I wanted to point out in this picture that it does come in various widths and sizes, and you can, with machinery anyway, crimp it together a little bit and cover vast swaths with your row cover. And row cover is another way to get an earlier jump on the season. And likewise, row cover will help at the end of the season. And those very first snows, it'll keep those snows off of your crops. And again, it will raise that temperature by about a degree or two. What is Sinead using over there, Tom?
She has a plastic with like vented holes.
Okay. Do you know if she bought that? We have some around the farm too. So first of all, there are different grades of row cover. And there is some that are very thin and they're meant more for insect control. And then there are some that you can buy that are thicker, and then that's meant more for heat control and frost protection. You can also apply 2 rows of the thin stuff in order to get the effects of the heavier stuff. But you can buy different grades of row cover from different companies. Of course, many people make it out there. Now, there's also stuff out there that is completely netting, insect netting. And I'm going to see if I can get a hit for it. Protect Net row cover. We'll see if we get a hit. Yeah, and it's a super fine screen. And you can get it for, I see more, that might be, no, that looks like more row cover, but it's a super fine screen that you can buy. Kind of looks like that, I guess, but it's made out of plastic. It's more reusable than row cover. Row cover is made out of plastic, by the way, too. It's a spun kind of woven plastic. But this stuff here is more durable than the very cloth kind of row cover. And this stuff here is useful for any time you don't want to add heat to your crops. So if you are row covering, say, cabbages, such as we are in the middle of summer, such as we are, sometimes, and I've had this experience once with rutabaga in particular, I've literally cooked rutabaga under too heavy of row cover in the past, where I should have been using a very, very fine, thin row cover. I used a heavier, like frost protection row cover is probably all I had available. And it lit, like you open it up and it smelled like cooked rutabagas under the row cover. And so this here is made to keep insects out, but like zero heat control. Oh, Tom, I think what Sinead is using is a product that came from my house. I used to use it back at Grassroot Organics. I bought a giant roll because it was the only thing I could buy. And that was a low tunnel is what Sinead's using out there, which is mini greenhouses out in the field. And the low tunnel will all have holes, perforated holes throughout it in order to allow a bit of airflow and not get too hot. Let's see if we can get a hit. Yeah, that's more of what looks like Sinead's using there. And
don't
that
think your
will
screen-
keep zero heat in at night. When the sun's down, you got no heat protection whatsoever. The holes let everything go. But during the daytime, and especially in the early mornings and the evenings as it's cooling off, we'll keep the temperature pretty warm under there. And
We can't see your screen.
oh, you can't see my screen. Rats, I'm doing all these searches. I thought you could see my screen. Thanks, Doreen. That's because I was using the stupid PowerPoint thing here for various reasons. Let me see. Let me see here. So that's what Sinead's using there. Is this low tunnel with the perforated plastic in it. As I say, keep zero heat in, but it does warm up crops, especially when the crops are young. So young basil, young peppers, young tomatoes, it will warm up that soil earlier in that area, and it'll keep it warmer than the outside temperatures in the early spring, and I guess into the fall as well. But it won't provide any heat overnight whatsoever. But it can create these little microclimates in your field. And so that could be a season extension technique as well in order to get an earlier jump on some of your heat-loving plants. And let me tell you, basil does love it under there. Peppers do love it under there. The thing about both basil and peppers, though, is when that plant grows up a little bit bigger, it doesn't like its leaves rubbed on the sides of these things. They'll blacken the leaves. So you got to take it off at a certain time. But at the beginning part of the season, this works really well to get your heat up in your field and create these little microclimates with these low tunnels. And that's what Sinead's using there. And so, as I was saying, row cover also works the other end of the season in the fall. It will provide just a couple of little extra degrees of heat and keep greens really well into like November even under there. Depends, of course, on the conditions. If you get too cold of a snap, you want to be able to harvest. But you can hold things really well into the fall using row cover, especially the heavier row cover into the fall. This here is a picture of a big giant field of squash, summer squash with row cover under it. And this is a big swath of row cover that you can purchase. Like I was saying, it comes in various sizes and lengths. There's different machinery that goes on the back of a tractor to help you lay this row cover. I got options in the row cover world. More row cover pictures. This is arugula. No, lettuce is under row cover. Anyway, row cover. Okay, so after row cover here, we're going to talk about low tunnels. Now, when we talk season extension, most people think season extension, you're looking to get things started a little bit earlier in the spring. You're looking to hold things a little bit later into the fall. But here we're talking about season extension on a particular crop of either, say, lettuce or cut greens of some sort. Now, lettuces and cut greens get tricky to grow in the middle of summer. Come August, when it's typically like hot and dry for a while, coming out of July, it gets tricky to grow lettuce reliably on an outdoor farm situation. So here is a low tunnel that David was playing with, where he's trying to create a microclimate in the field again, but he's trying to create a cooler microclimate by using this. When you use the row cover very low, it keeps heat in. But here he's using the row cover higher. Like these are like 6-foot hoops that you're looking at, and they're just bent conduit hoops into rebar posts that he has down. And this will serve as a way to cool that area of the field. And you'll notice here on the left-hand side, he's got some shade netting over even. And so that is keeping the, that's probably, I would assume, to the west, and keeping the warm afternoon sun off of his low tunnel. Julia, what do you got?
Is that what you have laid out by the wood pile behind the banks?
Yeah, so we have some shade netting here on the farm. We don't use it very often. I prefer just to not grow lettuce in the middle of summer. But again, from that for-profit point of view, if you can be at market with a crop that your competitors have a difficult time producing in the middle of the summer, you're going to be making money. You're going to be able to set that product price again. You're going to be the only one at market with it. And so it's worth your time financially to be able to do some of these things. Here at a community farm, I just choose to grow different crops. We just don't grow at a certain time. We won't plant any more lettuce. We won't grow any lettuce into mid-August, but then we'll pick back up again in the fall. So yeah, he's using the shade netting to provide shade and cool down this area, and then using the row cover again to provide shade into this area. Here's another picture of it, and then this is the inside. And so here he's growing some different baby cut greens. I see arugula, I see spinach, various different types of greens anyway in here. Head lettuce would do well under here too. And this is a way to keep that area of your farm cool in order to grow crops that prefer it a little bit cool. And again, you'd be the only one at market with it, and you'd be able to set the price. And from a financial point of view, it's a very good thing. David likes to say he included this picture because he likes it. Isn't it a nice picture? Okay, so coming out of that lettuce thing, David used to use those caterpillar tunnels for a number of years. Over 10 years, he would use those caterpillar tunnels. It's a technique he picked up from growers in upstate New York, where those are quite popular to use too, in order to, again, to cool that section of your farm to extend the season of just that particular crop of greens. But David said that over time, with his crop rotation that he does, where he's only market gardening a quarter of his 100 acres every year, the remaining of that 100 acres is being cover cropped. And he found over time, this is towards the end of his farming career, he found over time, the better he treated his land and the more healthy his land was and the more organic matter is in your land, the less he needed to do those tricks like the row cover, like the caterpillar tunnel row cover, because what is the best thing you can possibly do for your farm on many levels, including the season extension level, is have the healthiest soil possible. If you have the healthiest soil possible, your crops in general will put up with some stresses. They'll be able to withstand drought periods better. They'll be able to withstand temperature spikes better. The healthier your soil is, the more resilient your crops are going to be. So then that kind of lessens your need to do those caterpillar, like tricks like caterpillar tunnels, by increasing your soil fertility. And here we're looking at a cover crop cocktail that David was fond of. He would grow 3 different cover crops together. There was a sunflower, there was a sorghum grass, and then there was a pea. And the sunflower and sorghum grass would grow quite tall, and then the peas would twine up it and grow quite tall with it. And he would grow acres of this stuff. And then he would come by with his crop chopper. This here machine was originally made for making silage. That's those like wrapped hay bales that you see in the field, where they basically pickling hay, which is a season extension technique for hay too. But here he's just using it just for organic matter. And you're talking like this here would get, like, you can see it on his tractor, like it would get over the top of those tractor wheels. So you're talking like 5 feet of crop that he would run through with his crop chopper and create literally tons of organic matter. And he would do this multiple times over multiple years before his garden even was there, you know? And so he's creating all this organic matter and healthy soil, healthy crops, and that would put up with different stresses. And that's another way to help out that season extension, is to have the healthiest soil possible. Hey, Doreen, you got something?
What did he do with the stuff that he cut? Just leave it right there?
Yep, you're exactly right. Leaves it right there for to rot back into the soil, to compost, to decay back into the soil, feeding all of his soil microorganisms and macroorganisms. Yep, having a great system. I think I got somebody from the Multicultural Association now. So give me 1 second. I'll be right back. That's a cheesy picture of David with the bricks, and we'll talk about that one in a second. Maybe we'll keep it there. Hiya. Hey, how you doing? Yourself. Good. You picking up from the Multicultural Association? No, I'm not. Oh, you're not? Okay. No, I'm actually here to have a little visit. I'm in the military. Oh, yeah. I'm thinking to be doing my whole rehab here. Love it. Nice to meet you. Here. Yeah. Mark. Yeah. Right now, I am delivering an online classified. Oh, yeah. So you are extremely welcome to wander around. Put in. We got lots of different things underway going on. How long is your class? A couple hours? Yeah, I'll be wrapping up at 11. Nice to meet you. Busy farm this morning. That was not MCAF, that was a volunteer, which is good, from the military. So
Another question with
Yep.
that following question. Okay, so after he lays it down, he would do this in the fall, right? And then in the spring, would he have to till that land to make it farmable?
right. So yes, he was using a tractor, he was tilling. He was doing much like we did in field block 1, where it was tilled and then seeded. He would be out there with his seed drill in order to seed it. Now, if you wanted to do this in a no-till situation, it's entirely possible. What you would do there is you'd be looking at that crimping machine, that's magic crimping machine that I read about and I've never seen actually work. But with that crimping machine crimps the cover crop in such a way that it kills it and then lies it down flat. And then you go in there with your seed drill and then you seed, it literally drills seed into the soil. And then you grow another cover crop through that cover crop that you just crimped. So there's different models and different ways to do this. David, though, was after he did this, he would come back in with a set of discs and disc that field. And then reseed it, and you'd be able to get, he would be able to get 2 or 3 cuts off of his field just as a green manure cover crop every year. And then he would do that for multiple years before his organic garden got to that spot again. And again, you're talking like absolutely tons of organic matter. All of this and all of these plants, roots would go down and pick up different minerals from the soil, embody it in their plants, and then make it available for your other crop next year by putting it at the soil surface. An excellent technique. Okay, so we're talking about soil fertility here as a season extension technique. This is a way that David was measuring his soil fertility, was by measuring what's called the Brix. And so David has this Brixometer. Brixometer is my word. Refractometer is the right word. And so that's what he has up to his eye, is the refractometer. And so he would take his carrots there, and he would take the carrot greens. This here is obviously a staged photo, but he would take his carrot greens, you pulp it up and you kind of make it into this little bit of a liquid, and then you pop it into this little refractometer, and then you look through it. And then you get this kind of hazy line that develops. And the higher that hazy line develops, the more, the sweeter those carrots are going to be. And he can measure this just by testing the carrot greens. And the sweeter those carrots are going to be. And then that is a reflection of how healthy his soils are. And so David was a big fan of this refractometer and Brix. He has charts up that he was helping develop with the University of Guelph about where the ideal Brix levels should be for different vegetables at different times of the season. And it's all like spreadsheeted out and all done up. And we actually do have a refractometer here at the farm. I've never actually used it. I'm not one much to quantify kind of things. I like doing like good organic practices and kind of keep going in that direction. But David was a big fan of the Brix in order to determine health of vegetables, which would let him know about his soil fertility. And soil fertility is a good season extension technique. Again, so we're viewing this through the eyes of a for-profit farm. And the reason a for-profit farm wants to talk about season extension techniques is all about that cash flow, right? They're not just feeding themselves as you would at a homestead, and nothing wrong with that. I aim for that myself. But at a for-profit farm, when you talk about season extension, you're talking about being able to have enough cash flow to support the farm, and to be able to support the farmer and be able to support payroll, whoever you have hired on throughout the season. So as a good season extension technique on a for-profit farm, and even on a community farm, we still got to watch the bottom line and make sure we have enough money in the bank to operate, is being able to monitor your cash flow and being able to grow. If you can grow enough vegetables in the summertime, and sell enough vegetables in the summertime, because it's one thing to grow them and it's one thing to sell them. But if you can grow and sell enough vegetables in the summertime that can sustain your farm business throughout the wintertime, then there's no reason to go to market in the wintertime, right? And so from a for-profit point of view, when you are trying to think about season extension techniques, you're just trying to think about how your farm is going to have a proper cash flow to sustain the farm, sustain your payroll, including yourself, throughout those off seasons. And if you can, with proper bookkeeping and good accounting, if you can make enough money while the sun's shining, then you could afford to take your winters off. But a lot of farms do operate year round, especially organic market garden farms, and they are growing enough crops and they're planning out that way by doing their crop planning and doing the planning in order to grow enough crops to sell throughout the winter time to maintain that cash flow. So you can go about that cash flow in a couple different perspectives by growing and selling enough crops during the growing season that maintains you throughout the winter, or by growing and sustaining enough crops throughout the entire season to maintain your cash flow. It just depends on which way you want to go about doing it. But proper bookkeeping can be seen as a season extension technique on the for-profit farm and community farm too. We got to stay on top of our books. There's all sorts of different programs out there to help you out with your bookkeeping and your farm business in general. So here are some programs here. Some of them are Ontario based, but there are equivalents in New Brunswick as well. And some of them are federal. The federal one here is the Agri-Stability. If you keep good bookkeeping, I'm going to go back to this picture. If you keep good bookkeeping, you can apply for some of these programs. You can't just apply for a crop insurance program and you have no records of how much money you made off of this crop in the years gone by, because then they have no idea how much to pay you, right? So if you keep good bookkeeping and you have specific records of how much a profit or loss that you've made from your strawberries versus your carrots versus your hazelnuts versus this and versus that, and then you can apply for some of these programs. And when you apply for these programs, like the Agri-Stability, which is that federal program, they will ask you for some of those bookkeeping records. And if you have a lousy strawberry year because there was a late frost and killed all your blossoms and you have no strawberries this year to harvest, you can go back in your books and say, hey, in 2020, I made $2,000 off my strawberries. In 2019, I made $1,900 off my strawberries. In 2018, I made $2,000. And therefore, that's how much money you can apply for. And this Agri-Stability program will help you out with that. But it all relies back on good bookkeeping. So keeping good books and having good solid relationships with the accountant is a great thing to do for a for-profit farm and for the nonprofit farm as well. Let's talk about this here programs though for a second. I can tell you that, and I use the strawberry example on purpose here. My neighbor out in Keswick Ridge has a big strawberry patch. Last year, they did put through an application for insurance on their strawberries through like an Agri-Stability program. And in theory, they're my example where, you have all these good solid bookkeeping records and therefore they know how much they can pay you out. And there are government programs that do exactly that. But in practice, how this works out is they send somebody over to your farm to go view that strawberry patch because they want to make sure you're not shitting them, right? So they go and send somebody over to the strawberry patch. And usually, say, if you have that late frost, such as happened last year, and that's going to kill your blossoms, you don't usually get 100% loss. And so you might get, say, something like 80% loss. And that's enough to put through an application. But then you still have that, if you have 20% of a 2-acre strawberry patch, that's still a significant amount of strawberries, right? But through the insurance programs here, they don't allow you to harvest a single berry. They don't allow you to call somebody up, like a church organization, for example, or a food bank and say, hey, you can send over pickers and pick all these strawberries because I'm not going to do anything with them. Nope, that's not allowed either. What they want you to do, and you got to take pictures of this whole process, is they want you to mow back your strawberry patch and kill all of those strawberries because you can't possibly be double dipping. They don't want to send out a refund to you and have you sell any of those strawberries or even give them away, which is ridiculous, but that's the way these programs work out. So there's a little word to the wise on that one. Okay, so in the good bookkeeping vein of things here, David made this pamphlet up, and this is quite a few years ago, and he follows the rule of 45. Although when he was delivering this lecture to my students at Fleming College, and this was at least 5 years ago, he upped that rule to 60. And I imagine nowadays it'd probably be closer to like the rule of 90, although 60 is what I often use here at the farm. So what am I talking about when I say the rule of 60 or the rule of 45? That means that when you're going out to harvest something, and here's a challenge for everybody as we go through harvest days. On Tuesday's harvest day, we take a very slow approach. But into the future, as we get better at harvesting and we know what we're doing and we know how to go about harvesting these various things, what you want to aim for is $60 worth of harvest for every hour that you put in. So cucumbers is a good example. So if you're harvesting cucumbers, and let's say we are selling cucumbers at $2 per cucumber, just for a nice round even number. That means in 1 hour, you want to harvest 30 cucumbers. 30 times 2 is 60, right? And so 1 hour, you want to be able to harvest 30 cucumbers, get them washed, get them packed, get them into the cooler. And so that 1 hour includes not only picking time, but that packing, the washing and packing time as well. And so for every hour you spend in the field, you want to come back with an hour's worth of harvest, like into the cooler. Cucumbers is a nice, easy example, and 30 cucumbers, to pick 30 cucumbers in an hour and wash them and get them into the cooler, that's very reasonable. That's very possible to do. When you're talking about things like baby cut salad greens, that takes a little bit more time and consideration. Baby cut salad greens, a few years ago, I was selling those at $16 a pound. So let's go with a number of say you can get $20 a pound for baby cut salad greens. That means in 1 hour, you want to harvest 3 pounds of baby cut salad greens to get to that 60 number, and not only harvested, but washed, spun, and then into the cooler. And so David here on this example, with his rule of 45, breaks it down such as this. This is dated from at least 10 years ago, but he's saying that, of course, no farmer is going to pay any harvester $45 an hour, but that's the target that the harvester is aiming for. And here he breaks it down and he says that if you're paying the minimum wage in Ontario at that time was $11.50, and then you got to add in all of your various CP, Canada pension, employment insurance. This is the workplace safety insurance, which in New Brunswick is WorkSafe, New Brunswick, and holiday pay and vacation pay, and some breaks he even adds in there. And he even calculates for slack time in there. And so he figures that he's actually paying a harvester, even though that harvester's wage might be $11.50, he's figuring he's actually paying that harvester closer to about $15 an hour. And anyway, he breaks it all down and does all the math here. He's got us all charted in spreadsheets. You know, this is where I got my spreadsheeting from. And so he figures in order for a farm to be profitable, even if you're paying your harvester's minimum wage, you're trying to get that harvester to bring in that $60 an hour type rule. So that's my challenge to you, is next time you're out there harvesting, keep that number in mind and see if you can hit it. And so for some vegetables, it's relatively easy. And some vegetables, it's challenging. And as that for-profit farm, at the end of the year, if you are doing this kind of mental math as you're harvesting and making good little notes and saying, you know, I don't think I'm quite achieving that $60 an hour figure on my baby cut salad greens, at the end of the year, it's something that you got to look at and say, you know, why aren't I hitting that number? And maybe I should raise that price of that baby cut salad greens. And that's kind of what it looks like to run a for-profit farm, as opposed to that community farm where we're not too interested in these kind of numbers, because we're doing more things than just producing those vegetables. We're also doing here for education as well, for instance. But anyway, so when you're running a for-profit farm, keep that $60 an hour in mind. And that's my challenge to you when you're out there harvesting. Try to hit that $60 an hour kind of figure and see if you can do it. We'll gloss over this one here. This is some costs for a typical 5-acre market garden farm, and he breaks it all down. Again, keep in mind that this is a little bit dated. Not a lot of you are looking for this information, but for those of you that are, this here slideshow is available on our in-class folder and under the slideshow folder, and all those numbers are there just in case you wanted to look at it. All right, so back to the season extension vein here. After we got through the bookkeeping and good bookkeeping and what the harvester should be harvesting and all that kind of stuff, let's talk about root cellaring, because that's a lot of times that's exactly where people's minds go when they talk about, when they think about season extension. They think about root cellaring, and Doreen and I and Claire were just having a conversation on root cellaring just the other day. This is the root cellar that was purposely built and designed and dug over at Cookstown Greens. He sunk this down into the ground, and I don't exactly know how deep he sunk it, but this is the conversation Doreen and Claire and I were having. We were speculating. A lot of times when you look about root cellars online about how deep they should be, the 10-foot number often comes up. That's because below the ground at 10 feet, the temperature is relatively stable all year round at the same temperature, 10 feet down. That's usually around 10 degrees Celsius, give or take. And so you want your root cellar to be at least 10 feet down. But if you think about it, you also want to stand up in your root cellar, right? So you're talking like 6 to 8 foot ceilings in your root cellar. So I want that 10-foot mark to be about half of that. So I would dig a root cellar down to about 15 feet myself. So that 10 foot is at 5 feet. And then, you know, you get that kind of effect that you want. I don't quite know what David dug his depth to, but I would assume at least 10 feet, probably a little bit deeper. The interesting thing I want to point out at this picture, though, is the multiple rooms that were built into this root cellar. That's because different vegetables have different sweet spots. And too often on organic farms, and ours is the same here, we just have one storage area. We have one cooler, and we're trying to hit averages for all these different mixed vegetables that really on a chart, and there are charts out there, really on a chart that have different temperatures that they should be stored at, but we're just trying to hit averages here. By having multiple rooms in your root cellar, you can do different temperatures and different humidity levels in these different rooms to better hit that sweet spot for fewer vegetables, as opposed to having one common room to hit the sweet spot for all the vegetables. This here, after it was sunk, this here is the entrance to the root cellar. Stairs going down. You see a vent pipe. Airflow is important on root cellars, and you'll see a vent pipe here where they're sucking in fresh air. This here is one of the rooms in the root cellar, and this is how much veg you used to grow. And so here you're seeing these plastic perforated bags. And you can get these. This is what most commercial growers are using nowadays, even like those small to medium scale organic farms, such as David was operating. David was firmly in that medium category. There's certainly larger farms out there than him, and certainly smaller. So a lot of the people are using these perforated plastic bags. And so you can buy these from different organizations. There is a place in Ontario called Tempo Plastics. That's where David was buying these from. That's where I was buying these from. And you're looking at, there are bushel bags that are capable of holding 50 pounds of beets, 50 pounds of potatoes, 50 pounds of carrots, you name it. They're bushel bags. And then they're all perforated with just tiny holes throughout the bag. And those holes enable whatever produce you have in that bag to breathe. Now, you'll notice this when you go to the grocery store and say you pick up a bag of grapes. It's often in perforated bags, and the perforations on a bag of grapes are actually quite large because it wants a lot of airflow. It doesn't want a high humidity environment. Different vegetables will want different levels of humidity. And so you can buy these perforated bags with more or less or smaller or bigger holes in them to achieve different humidity levels. If you store carrots, for example, in a bag that's in a plastic bag that's not perforated, it builds up a gas. It might be ethylene gas, but it might be different. But anyway, a gas builds up into the bag, and the sweetness of the carrots actually plummet, and your instances of mold will go up. And so all vegetables need to breathe. And so that's what these perforated bags are for. Now here at Hayes Farm, our workaround on these is our wet produce wraps. It still enables vegetables to breathe, keeps the humidity high. The downside of the wet produce wrap, especially when you're talking about long-term storage, because I do use wet produce wraps for long-term storage myself at home, but you have to go in there and you have to refresh those wraps every now and again and re-wet them. but it also is a good opportunity to go through your storage veg and pull out anything that's rotten. But on a big farmy commercial kind of level, you wouldn't want to do that on this room. That would be a nightmare. So this is a reason why they're using these big plastic perforated bags. Things to point out in this room here is that these bags are a little bit lying on top of each other, but not a lot lying on top of each other. You'll see maybe like a stack of like 2 bags on top of each other. But you don't want to keep stacking on top of each other, because then you lose that perforation kind of thing, right? There's no point in having perforated bags if you're going to stack all of these bags on top of each other tight. You're going to lose that breeding. So he's got a racking system, and so you got these bags way up here, but he used to have this like pallet jack that would come up here and lift this pallet off at a time, and it was all he had these machines that would do this kind of thing for him, so he didn't have to like lift these 50-pound bags up on top all the time. Another thing to point out here is ventilation. There's fresh air ducts all throughout this system here, and you got fans in the back pushing air too, and there's always ventilation going through here. You see all that pipe on the outside, that was the fresh air pipe bringing fresh air down, fresh cold air down into here. Vegetables, especially stored like this, will generate a certain amount of heat. They'll kind of try to compost, and that's another thing. If you had them in just a solid bag, they will compost over time. They will just compost in that bag. But having the perforated bag and having the fresh cold air come in from the outside keeps the temperature low. And then you also need some vents that bring the air out. And I believe that's what these fans in the back did. They sucked the air out. And so then you get that constant flow going through of fresh cold air coming in and then the air going out. It keeps everything chilled. And then as the vegetables want to generate heat, they keep they're at the proper temperature. Any other questions about root cellaring, root storage here before we move on?
I was wondering, like, how much electricity would that take? Like, I mean, like, is it a huge energy input, or is it like pretty low requirements? Or
a darn fine question, and I bet David had this all spreadsheeted out and had a better answer for you than I do. However, pretty low. You're just dealing with some fans on low. The light bulb would be only on when you're in there. It'd be off otherwise. The vent outside, just naturally, by having these fans that vent out, it would just naturally suck air in. So I would think electricity costs are actually pretty low. Maybe just the cost of operating a few fans. So next up here, David has pictures of various things that he would store in cold storage and for long-term storage over the winter. Carrots, of course, store extremely well over the winter in conditions such as that. But on a homesteady level, like I was saying, I use the black crates. I use wet produce wraps, and I will store carrots in black crates like that, stacked up, so they're not like squashing each other, and stacked up in the black produce crates and then wrapped up in wet produce wraps and refresh those wraps monthly. In my carrots, I stored them into the spring. We were eating carrots into June this year, and so carrots will store wonderfully like that. Beets will store wonderfully like that. We were eating beets up until like close to July this year, to tell you the truth. Potatoes store wonderfully down in those kind of conditions as well. Same with the perforated bags. Squash, though, let's talk about squash. Squash likes to be stored in low humidity conditions. So in that root cellar we were just looking at, that is high humidity conditions when those bags, and you might even increase the humidity in some cases if you need to by putting out buckets of water into your cellar, and that will increase the humidity just naturally in your cellar. But squash, they like very low humidity. And so that is one of the reasons you have those multiple rooms. So you wouldn't store your squash in with those bags of perforated vegetables. You would store squash in your own separate room. It likes airflow, so you don't want to store them in heaps. Like when you're harvesting, you see them in heaps here, but you don't want to store them in heaps in your storage. You want to kind of lay them out on a shelf singly. You can get away with doubling, maybe a little bit of tripling, but like you don't want to store them in heaps in your cellar. They like it cool, but they like low humidity. So at a homesteading level, I have my root cellar, and we'll see this next Monday. I'll take you into my basement, and I have my root cellar, and that's where I store my vegetables, such as those carrots and beets we were just seeing, and potatoes. Then in the basement proper, where I have a dehumidifier running, then I will store, that's where I rack up my squash, where it's cool and low humidity. That's what squash prefers. And in those kind of conditions, you can store squash all the way into spring. Another trick with squash is to cure it. And not a lot of folks are doing this, especially in the organic, small scale market garden kind of level. But my Amish friend Milo, he used to grow sweet potatoes. He was an excellent sweet potato grower. His sweet potatoes were just second to none. And with sweet potatoes, in order to cure and hold your sweet potatoes, in order to hold your sweet potatoes, you have to cure them. And to cure sweet potatoes, you're looking at 80%, storing them in an environment of 80% humidity and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And I don't have a translation to Celsius on that. It's just easy to remember 80 and 80. And so 80% humidity, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're looking to keep your sweet potatoes in that in that environment for a week or two. And then that eliminates something called black rot on your sweet potatoes, and your sweet potatoes will store well into spring. If you throw some squash in that environment too, it does the same effect. It eliminates that black rot. And I've seen squash like store like well into like June after being treated and cured like that. Yeah, sweet potatoes though. That's what I want to say. On a home level, you can accomplish the same thing. Oh, Dallas, you got something?
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious about like root veg and things like potatoes. Like, do they have to be cleaned like extremely well before you put them into storage?
Hey, fantastic question. Carrots, beets, and potatoes, and parsnips, and celeriac, and I'm trying to think of other examples, and I'm forgetting a lot, but I leave them dirty. I don't leave them excessively dirty in the when I'm packing them, but like I don't go through any trouble of washing them. I might, especially in clay soil here at Hayes Farm, I might knock off a little bit of the clunky clay soil. At my place, I got sandy soil, and I leave as much dirt on as I possibly can, and I store everything dirty, and that actually helps keep them in storage. You only want to wash things up pre-sale or pre-use, whether you're talking like for-profit or homestead kind of level. After you wash things up, their shelf life actually tends to go down. So you want to store things dirty. The exception on this again though might be that oddball squash. Like I was saying, squash I store outside and of my root cellar area in my basement. I store it in low humidity instead of high humidity. I know some farmers that will wash their squash in a light hydrogen peroxide or light bleach solution and rub off dirt that way, and they claim that hydrogen peroxide or bleach will eliminate that black rot that I was just talking about. But another way that you can eliminate that black rot, where I was going here, and this works for both sweet potatoes and squash, is just to use the oven trick. And this is how I cure my sweet potatoes every year, is I will put my sweet potatoes just on a couple of baking trays. And I don't grow a lot of sweet potatoes. It's more of like a hobby kind of thing, a bit of a treat to have on occasions at home. And I will grow my, put the sweet potatoes with sand on them, with my sandy soil on them. And sweet potatoes grow best in sand, by the way, too. So you don't typically grow sweet potatoes in clay soil. But you put the sweet potatoes onto a baking tray with a bit of sand on them, and you put that into the oven. And then just using the oven light, you can achieve that 80 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. And then in order to get the humidity up, I just put a pan of water underneath it. Actually, I don't even monitor the humidity level. I just always have a pan of water in that oven with it. So at the very bottom of my oven, I got a pan of water, and then I'm using my oven racks to have 2 baking sheets of sweet potatoes in the oven. And we'll keep it like that for about 10 days, give or take. Everybody's sick of having sweet potatoes in the oven at the end of 10 days, because anytime you use in the oven, you always got to take them out. But it does work remarkably well, and you can cure sweet potatoes just in your home oven, just using that technique. And you can cure squash in there at the same time, and they will hold remarkably long after being cured like that.
Because I've even heard of people like storing their potatoes in soil. Like they'll have barrels full of soil that they store their potatoes in.
Right. And have you heard of storing carrots in sand?
No, not.
Oh, that's a very popular one, and that's something that Tom and Louise like to do. And they'll talk about that, I bet, at their place, especially if we give them a little nudge and get them talking about it. But storing things in sand, especially root vegetables in sand, and especially damp sand, is another technique. There, though, you got to make sure that the sand is at the proper humidity level. Like, it's got to be damp, but not like standing water. And if the sand dries out, then you're going to end up with like rubbery carrots. I find the way I store carrots with the dirt on and then into the produce wrap and then into my cellar, I have crisp carrots all the way to June. Like, they're perfectly fine and crisp. Of course, some are going to rot in storage, and I try to weed those out sooner. But I find with the sand technique, you end up with like kind of limpy kind of carrots. And if I'm going to go through the trouble of growing carrots and storing carrots, I want my carrots to be better than what I can buy at the grocery store. And I don't want limp carrots, you know what I mean? So I don't know, I find my method works really well for me. Tom and Louise prefer the sand method, and we can talk to them about that. But getting back to your potatoes and storing them in dirt, yeah, that's another technique that can be used. I don't find I need to, though. Again, I leave my dirt on, do the whole produce wrap kind of thing, put them in the basement, in my cellar, right on the basement floor, and they store remarkably well. Actually, I think I still have some fingerling potatoes kicking around in my crisper at the moment from last year. But yeah, there are all sorts of different techniques in the root cellar that you can use. And so maybe different conditions will allow some different styles to be better for some people than others. But I'm just telling you kind of what works for me. But you mentioned holding potatoes in soil. And as you saw on the farm here, there are, in each of your field blocks, there are volunteer potatoes that were coming up from potatoes that were missed in last year's harvest. And storing things in the field is exactly where we're going here next. And sometimes you can get away with storing something in the field for a remarkably long time. Depends on your season, depends on your conditions and this and that. But there are like cold tolerant varieties that are meant to be grown in the fall. And here we're looking at a cold tolerant spinach, and it looks quite frozen, right? But this here will handle that cold no problem. This here picture, David would say he harvested this spinach into December. And if you choose the right variety, they will hold in the field for you for a remarkably long time. So you can just leave it in the field and harvest when you're ready for it, as opposed to having to bring everything in and put it into storage. Brussels sprouts are another great example in this category. In Ontario, and actually here too, in New Brunswick, I've held Brussels sprouts into late December. I've harvested Brussels sprouts outside for Christmas in late December. And they were frozen. They're completely frozen outside. And you know how they grow on a stalk. You're just out there picking them off the stalk completely frozen. Makes for some cold fingers, but you're not out there for very long. And you can hold Brussels sprouts in the field up until like late December. You can hold some varieties of spinach into the field going into December. Parsnips hold, we dug parsnips this spring, right? Parsnips will overwinter all year, and you can dig them at any time, assuming your soil's not frozen. But up until the point where your soil gets frozen, you can dig them. And then again in the spring, as soon as the soil thaws, you can hold them and dig them then. What do you got, Dallas?
I was just kind of curious about, like, as far as, because sometimes we have like fairly snowy Decembers, like,
yep,
it's not extremely common, but is like snow removal going to be like kind of a thing that you got to consider when you're with your crops, like clearing off certain crops, or do you keep them cover cropped, or keep them row covered during the wintertime type of deal? Is that kind of what we're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. There's many things you can do. Is one, watch the forecast. And if you're expecting, if you have something like spinach out in the field and you're expecting a big dump of snow, maybe it's time to harvest that spinach and then bring it in and try to hold it for as long as you can. But it depends on the forecast. If you don't got a big snowy December, you can hold that spinach out in the field for a long time. And if you only get like, maybe just a foot of snow, the thing about Brussels sprouts is they grow in a big stalk and they grow tall, and you can still harvest quite a bit. And I have dug around Brussels sprouts under snow and still harvested them. The right variety of kale too. There's a kale called winter borer kale, and that will hold extremely well into the wintertime. And I've like kicked snow off of my kale and harvested it completely frozen, brought it in, thawed it out, and it's fine. It's fine to eat. And so, yeah, you got to watch out. Row cover will help you with that. If you're using the very thin row cover though, sometimes you'll have so much of a snow load that you're going to rip the row cover taking it off. But if you're using a thicker row cover, so it's often easier to keep the snow off with a thicker row cover. But yeah, you certainly got to watch the forecast and keep in consideration of those snow loads. Kale, as I was saying, another one that holds very well into the field. This here is broccoli rabe, also known as rapini. Yeah, we're not going to get in that one. Romanesco cauliflower, it's a beautiful one. Fennel holds extremely well into the winter as well. And here's a picture of exactly that, removing snow in order to harvest something here. These fellas from Mexico are going like, what the hell are we doing here? Here's a picture of David removing snow from his greenhouse. You got to worry about that, and sometimes in the winter time too. In New Brunswick, it's more of a consideration than in Ontario for sure. Anytime you get a nice light powdery puffy snow, it'll hit the top of the greenhouse and it'll shed off as beautifully as you want it to possibly shed off, and that's great. But if you get that sticky freezing rain, icy kind of rain first, sleet kind of thing, that'll stick to the sides of the greenhouse, and then you get a snow after that, and I've seen that happen many times in the short while I've been here in New Brunswick. Then that snow will stick on your greenhouse. When that snow sticks on your greenhouse, it ruins that 2-layer of plastic effect that you have happening because it'll just crush it. And then you got to get out there and remove snow. And so in the wintertime around Hayes Farm, I'm out here, I don't know, a few times in the wintertime, checking in on the hoop house for sure, removing snow sometimes. And then maybe once or twice in the season, after enough snowfall goes down, the snow builds up along the sides, right? Because it's always going to slough down along the sides and it'll get to about waist height. And then a couple of times during the winter, we're out here removing that snow from being waist height. The problem with the snow being waist height on the sides is, well, it actually does good stuff by holding the plastic really tight, and it keeps your greenhouse nice and insulated. But as greenhouses being greenhouses, it heats up in your greenhouse and then melts the edges of the snow along the sides, and then turns those edges of the snow to ice along the sides. And then you have problems with sometimes as that snow breaks up and that ice breaks up, it can rip the plastic a bit. And so that's why you want to remove the snow along the sides sometimes. What time is it right now? 10:30. That's not so bad. Okay. So yeah, sometimes you got to remove the snow along the sides of the greenhouse. And yeah, so now let's talk about greenhouse growing as a season extension technique here. David has experimented with different things over the years. Here you're seeing the greenhouse using water as a heat sink in the greenhouse. And here he has many 1.5 liter bottles of plastic bottles suspended from the ceiling, and they're about 3/4 full of water. Let me see if I can find a Google hit on this to get some BTU action. So there's a whole thing that happens with when water cools, water cooling plus BTU. A BTU is your British thermal unit, and that is it's your standard measurement of a heat unit. So that's what a BTU is, and that's how you measure heat. Just like we use like Fahrenheit or Celsius for temperatures, BTUs is used to measure heat. BTU expelled when water cooling, and there's a formula for this. That for like every 1 degree that water cools, it lets off 1 BTU. And I'm trying to find a hit for this. BTU, I'm trying to find the right language here. How many BTUs does water emit when freezing? Okay, so Still trying to find I have the information written down someplace, but anyway, so as water cools, okay, so in this picture here, we're just seeing of that greenhouse with the bottles hanging. As one liter of water cools for every degree Fahrenheit that it cools, it lets off 1 BTU. And so then if you have many of these bottles, it's going to let off many BTUs. But at the point where that water freezes, where that water, the temperature of that water goes down to that freezing point, it lets off, it expels quite a bit of BTUs. And here is that exactly what I'm saying there. It lets off 144 BTUs in order to turn that water from liquid state to solid state. And now that's not exactly heat that we're going to go and like put our hands over and feel that heat as that water cools. But it is enough heat, again, to make that difference in plants. And so I'm going to go back here to this here. And it is enough to make a difference in plants. So as these water heats during the day, the temperature of the water is going to rise, the sun's going to go down, and then that hot water is slowly going to cool down. And as that hot water slowly cools down, it lets off BTUs. And then when it gets to that freezing point, it lets off a rush of BTUs. And this is all enough to keep the greenhouse just above that freezing point, given, of course, the ambient conditions outside. So here you're using water as a heat sink in order to kind of heat the greenhouse in the middle of winter. And David's played around a lot with that, and he had it all mathed out and whatnot, and that's where I got this information from in the first place. And so this here is an example that David was playing around with for passive greenhouse heating. And so if you choose the right crops of greens to grow in your greenhouse, and this is exactly what a lot of organic growers grow in their greenhouse over the winter, is very cold hardy greens, such as that variety of lettuce we were talking about, that variety of kale we were talking about. Arugula is a cold hardy green, cilantro, chard is a cold hardy green, and there's many different cold hardy greens that you can grow in your greenhouse over the winter. And here is a passive greenhouse without any heating system. He's just using water as heat sinks. David used to hang out with Elliot Coleman from Maine, and Elliot Coleman's a bit of a famous organic farmer from Maine, and he does passive greenhouse as well, passive greenhouse growing. Elliot Coleman's got a couple of books out there, but what made Elliot Coleman the famous gardener that he is he's a farmer that takes his summers off, relatively. He focuses all on off-season sales, fresh greens grown in Maine, in the off season in passive greenhouses. And Elliot Coleman will have this nice greenhouse set up, and then he'll use row cover over top of his greens. And he'll even, I've read, set up a greenhouse inside the greenhouse by running high tension cables from one end of the hoop house to the other, and then putting a greenhouse plastic over top of that. And so you have a greenhouse in a greenhouse with the row cover over top of your greens. And he was able to grow greens and hold them, because the growing part is that's like late fall. That's when you want to grow your greens to maturity. And then you hold them in your greenhouse all throughout the winter in a mature state. And they don't really grow very much because it is so cool. There's not really much active growth on these greens, but they're just holding, and they're holding beautifully. And so then he'll get in there in January or maybe for like the Christmas rush. And I bet he can sell a lot of greens over Christmas and the holiday season. And he'll go in there and cut all these things and bring them to market at a time when much of his competition doesn't have anything fresh. They're selling all root vegetables and whatnot. And he's the one there with fresh greens, and he's able to charge a premium. And he managed his books accordingly well, that he's maintained his cash flow throughout the season. And he is able to take his summers off. And that was the kind of claim to fame in his books there. So yeah, that's some greenhouse growing, some passive greenhouse growing over winter as a season extension technique. David was also experimenting with holding leeks in his greenhouse over winter. And so this sounds like a lot of work to me, and I'm not sure if I'm quite into it, but he found it profitable to harvest leeks out in the field. then set up a little bit of a bank inside of his greenhouse, and it'd be a long bank, and then put those leeks in super tight. And like basically transplant mature leeks from the field into this greenhouse and then hold them over winter in his greenhouse. And he found that profitable for him, and he's able to sell these leeks because they're nice, like fresh leeks that were still like holding well in the field as opposed to in storage. Storage leeks, you often have to strip back a little bit more to make them more presentable. But then these here leeks he brought from the field into his greenhouse and stored them like that as a season extension technique there for the leek. Hardy lettuces, that's what this picture is. This is a very hardy type of lettuce that I forget the name of, I'll be honest, but there are hardy lettuces out there that will grow in the greenhouse over winter. And that's the end of David's slideshow. Now I like to contrast this with some of the things I was doing at Grassroot Organics, season extension wise. Because in the Kawartha Lakes there, much like this area, there's really only like 6.5 months of active growing and then 5.5 months of off season. And so as a farmer, you want to be able to have that cash flow all year round, or as a homesteader, you want to be able to have those vegetables year round, and you only have 6.5 months of active growing season, but you want to be able to eat all year round. I'm going to go a little bit quick through this. One of those things, of course, for season extension that we haven't talked about yet, that wasn't mentioned in David's slideshow, is value added products. And that is a way to kind of make any of your perishable produce into shelf stable products. And here we're talking about things like jams and jellies and pickles and preserves and ferments and frozen fruits and vegetables. My wife used to make various soaps and salves from different botanicals produced on the farm. We experiment a little bit with bread baking. Curing and smoking is another value added product that it could be considered for meats there in particular. Now I've tried many of these different things over the years and had different successes with different products. What essentially though, you gotta, like a lot of people that get into farming on a small scale, kind of new kind of level, think about value added quite a bit, I have noticed. But what I always try to point out here is as soon as you get into value added products, you're essentially running two businesses at the same time. You are growing it, you're running the farm, and then you're also running this like cannery, we'll say. And those are essentially two different businesses. And in order for your business to be profitable, your farm, in theory, doesn't always work out in practice, but in theory, your farm should be making a profit off of what it's selling to your cannery. There is no point of like, as they say, the old saying is robbing Peter to pay Paul kind of thing. There's no point of taking these vegetables and putting them through this canning value added process and still making the same profit as you would have made just selling those vegetables. You know what I mean? There's no point of doing both if you're not going to make that net profit to represent both businesses. Now, often when you're talking value added products, you are selling your grade A, let's say strawberries at market at a premium. And then if you have any grade B strawberries, your number twos, that's what you're going to use in your value added chain. And if you can make all of your profit from your strawberry patch at market to kind of balance and negate the fact that you're kind of giving strawberries to your cannery business, then that could work out fine because you're still making your profit. But in the end, you got to make sure you got to make sure that the extra effort you're putting in is going to pay for itself. What do you got, Julia?
I was just gonna say, I feel like this is an area where like cooperatives and like the community farm model is like so helpful, because like, you know, owning and operating like a certified kitchen space is like a huge expense. But like, I know my neighbor, she like does a lot of like baking and jam making, and she just lives in a little apartment, but she was partnering with the Villeneuves and she'd go use their kitchen space. Or like, I know a baker, and she exchanges, like she does their social media for the like Chef Rick guy at the market to use his kitchen space. So I feel like having like partnerships where you don't have to have like everyone has their own kitchen space would be kind of cool.
Man, oh man, is there so much unused kitchen space out there. Like even if you look at your average restaurant, and let's say you have a restaurant that serves breakfast, lunch, and dinner, overnight that kitchen's not being used. If you look at, and seriously, I've known farmers and gardeners that got into these kind of things and use like kitchen space at the odd times in order to get access to these things, because there's a lot of kitchen space out there that's not always used. Church basements are almost always certified kitchens, because they have to be when they do any kind of functions, and they're only used like once a month often. And church basements make an awesome place for you to approach to get some certified kitchen space. Now, just between you and me and the internet here, I've known people in the past, I'm not saying that you should be shady, but I've known people in the past that will use a church kitchen basement once, twice a month, and then do other things at home. And then you have a receipt from you paying that church kitchen basement. And then you just go to farmer's market and say, yeah, I made everything out of this church kitchen basement. You know, things like that happen all the time. But you do need some access to a certified kitchen space, especially if you are going to be audited sooner or later by a health unit kind of person with what you do. You certainly do need that certified kitchen space. You need some sort of paper trail, some sort of receipt, something that says that you're in some sort of certified kitchen space. And yeah, there's all sorts of different options out there. Although I do know of a farm, Vicky's Veggies, in Prince Edward County, Ontario, that did put in like an addition to their house of just a certified kitchen space. And then they hired a chef throughout the entire season just to use off all of their number twos and that kind of stuff. Whether or not that paid for itself, I don't know, but it is an idea. These things do get tried. But my big takeaway here is you got to recognize that you are now running two businesses. Likewise, on a farm, maybe I'm going off a little bit of a tangent here, but likewise on a farm, if you are running a delivery business on your farm, like doing restaurant deliveries, say, that is another business too. And you got to make sure that your delivery business is making enough money to pay for its delivery driver, even if that happens to be you. And I'm getting ahead of myself here. This is kind of stuff I talk about in that holistic farm business planning course in September. But like, if you got to look at your farm as its own operation. And if you're doing delivery door to door to restaurants, that is a delivery service that you're offering. And that's got to pay for itself too. Just like the value added end of your business has to pay for itself. You just got to break these things down. You can't run it all under one umbrella of a farm, even though in practice, that's often how it's done. You got to think about it in the right way to make sure it's being profitable for yourself. So better than the pickles, well, for me anyway, I've had more success with dried goods than in that canning kind of department and the fermenting and pickle kind of department. Dried goods are super easy. I have never, ever been asked, I did this for many years, and I never, ever been asked by a health unit person about like certified kitchen space and dried goods. And so in the dried good department, what has been my number one seller is herbs. And I've mentioned this before to a few different people, is I would go to market weekly, and I was known as the herb guy at this Toronto farmers market. And I would cut all of the herbs that I had available on the farm at that given time, bring it to market. And I know I'm bringing too much herbs to market. However, having heaps out on a table sells. If you only have like 5 bunch at a table of like anything given, like people just walk past you and this and that. But if you're like having to stand on your tippy toes to look over the carrots, it just attracts so many people to your stand. It just has such a much more presence. And so I found the bigger I went with my herbs, the more herbs I sold. However, the bigger I went with my herbs, I would have leftovers. And I would simply do exactly what we see here in the background. I would make bunches such as you see, bring them all to market. Anything that doesn't sell, I have a box of paper clips. You just open that paper clip up, just like give it a twist, and then you have an instant hook, and you just hook it up. And I used to have lines going across my old farmhouse. I had big 10-foot ceilings. I used to have lines going across, and we just hang herbs up there. And then I would bring them back to market. And typically I was selling like small bunches of fresh herbs for $2 at market. And then in the wintertime, I'd bring back the dried herbs and sell them at $2.50, just for that extra effort of having to put them away and store them and bring them back. And again, I've never been asked about certified kitchen space when drying herbs. And then other dried things, of course, are things like beans, like dry beans. It certainly helps if you have some sort of shifter shaker to help you thresh them and sort them as well. A lot of time and effort can go into hands threshing and sorting. Trust me, I've done a lot of that. But herbs is something that did very well for me. Beans is something I used to sell all winter long too. Cut flowers, especially if you know your flowers and are selective about the varieties, like feverfew, for example, dries absolutely beautifully. Cut flowers can dry over the wintertime and then be hung up and then be brought back to market to be sold. And then I used to also dry cherry tomatoes, especially my number 2 cherry tomatoes or number 2 tomatoes. If you're growing a nice beefsteak tomato, often you can get like just a slight bruise or a spot on it and this and that. Nobody wants to buy that, but if you slice that and put it into your dehydrator, you can bring that back in the wintertime and sell these kind of things, and then the hot peppers as well. My tip though with the tomatoes and hot peppers is you should have a value in mind of that tomato going into the food dehydrator and a value in mind when it comes out. Because say you have a tomato, a nice big beefsteak tomato that in theory you could have got $2 for at the market. If you slice that up and by the time you're done dehydrating it, you've put in now more time and effort in, and you still want to be able to get that $2 worth out of it, right? If you could have sold it at $2 for in the first place, why put it in the dehydrator? So you got to keep in mind the value of it going out, and then the value of it coming back, or the value of it going in, and then the value of it coming back out. There's no point in putting in a $2 tomato into a dehydrator and then selling the contents for $1 later. You're not making money that way. So yeah, you got to, because when things dry, of course they'll shrink quite a bit, and so yeah, you got to do this math ahead of time and keep it tracked, and you make sure you're getting as much value, if not more, by putting it into that dehydrator and using electricity to dehydrate. Root cellaring and storage, we talked about that there with David. And back with grassroot organics, I didn't even have a great cold storage area, and I used to just store the stuff in my farmhouse basement, and I used to be able to store many different things just in an old farmhouse basement, let alone David's, state of the art setup there that he had. But yeah, an old farm, like some of those old farmhouses, like I was living in an 1860 farmhouse back in Ontario, and some of those old farmhouses, their basements were literally built for storing kind of vegetables like this, because that's what they used to do. So you don't need a whole lot sometimes. And then right varieties. I was talking about that with spinach, for example. There's some spinach varieties, some kale varieties that will take the cold and do very well into the winter. There are some varieties that are meant to be stored. For example, there's only one variety of kohlrabi that I know about that is a storage variety of kohlrabi. Other varieties of kohlrabi will rot within a month in storage, but the Cossack kohlrabi grows quite large, and it can store for months and months in the cold storage. Chinese cabbage, despite the fact that it is a leafy vegetable going into storage, stores remarkably well. And an Amish friend of mine, Henry Hirschberger, used to grow a variety called Mishili, and it would hold extremely well into the springtime. Chickabiddy Acres, they used to have a root cellar that was quite remarkable. It's the only one I've ever seen. I was trying to find pictures online, but I can't find anything. I think they take about as much pictures as I do, which is not very many. They sunk basically a greenhouse. So our greenhouse has hoops that are 4 feet wide. They slammed their hoops to be just 6 inches wide. They sunk an entire greenhouse into a hillside, covered that with earth, covered that with straw, and they have what they call their hobbit hole of a cellar, and it works remarkably well. And there's another tip too, when we're talking about root cellaring. David's was, he had a very flat farm, and he dug down and made the root cellar. But if you're able to build a root cellar into a hillside, sometimes you don't need to dig down. Sometimes you just need to dig in if you're building it into a hillside. And I've seen some beautiful root cellars dug into hillsides. So another thing I wanted to mention as a season extension tool is farm diversification. There are some farm products that are obviously less perishable than the produce that we grow around here. If you're getting into meats, you can get into cured meats, you can get into frozen meats. Honey never goes bad. Maple syrup it can go bad, but stays good for a very long time. Hay stored well, you can sell year round. Grains stored well and rodent free, you can sell year round. So there are different products that you can grow on a farm and produce on a farm that is not as seasonal dependent as fresh produce. How are we doing on time? 10:50, not bad, not bad. I'll keep going for a few more minutes here. And then I also want to mention, and again, I talk more about this in that holistic farm business planning program that starts in September, but the off-farm job as a season extension tool. So again, from that for-profit point of view, you want to be able to maintain enough cash flow to keep yourself going throughout the winter or throughout your off season. And there's nothing wrong with an off-farm job. Some people I know think it's kind of dirty words, and I've heard some people say that any time spent off farm is time wasted. You're working for somebody else, and that kind of attitude. But there are many off-farm jobs that you can get that pays you for your farm experience. When I wrote these slides here, this year is from my Fleming College days, and I was teaching part-time in the wintertime in Fleming College, and that's why that little note is like what that gig for me. And so I would work on the farm all the way till the entire farming season, and then come to the end of November, I would start teaching at Fleming College until early April, and it was a great off-farm job for me. Paid me well, and it was a great little off-farm job for me. And so it was a very useful tool to my farm to be able to have an off-farm job that paid me for my farming experience. Then there's other off-farm jobs that will allow you to learn skills to bring back to the farm, such as working in construction or in bookkeeping or even cooking. And you get paid for those experiences, and you can bring it back to the farm. And then also the off-farm job will increase your potential for networking and sales by being able to introduce yourself to new people. All right, so here are a couple of tricks I've learned over the years. If you want to be the first to market with stuff, and as I was saying, being first to market is a very profitable position to be in for a for-profit farm. There are some crops that are often direct seeded outside that you can kind of get away with growing them inside and then transplanting them out. Beet is an example of that. So far here at Hayes Farm, we've only direct seeded beets, but you can start beets inside and then transplant them out. Now, the risk that you're running into is, even though the beet kind of looks like it grows, like especially like a nice round traditional beet, it looks like it grows all above the soil, but it does have that taproot that goes down actually quite deep. It's a very fine hair-like taproot that goes down quite deep. And when you start it in 4-inch pots or those little 4-cell packs, that hair-like root will go down and it'll hit the bottom of that pot or that container, and then it'll start to twist. And when it does that, it affects the way the rest of the beet's going to grow. So if you start beets inside in order to get an early jump on the season, and it works, I've done this myself. It'll get you you'll get your beets to market an extra week or two earlier than your competition, and it's a profitable position to be in. But you can never grow that beet for a nice big mature beet. You will always have to harvest that beet as a baby beet, because that hair-like root, when it gets messed up, it affects the way the rest of that beet is going to grow, and it will never grow into a big mature beet. It'll start to grow more greens and do different stuff and get woody before it gets big. But it will grow a nice, dependable baby beet, and you'll be the first to market with baby beets, and that is a profitable position to be in. I've never tried it with radish, but I've seen my Amish friends do it, and radish works like that as well. And again, radish grows much like a beet and sends down that fine hair-like taproot. And you might not be able to grow a mature radish that way, but you can grow baby radish that way. And in some markets, and like my old market, baby radish was quite popular and quite profitable. You can never do that with carrot though. Carrot being a big taproot that goes down. Once it hits that bottom of the pot and curls around, then it's done. It just doesn't grow into a proper carrot anymore. So carrot's not one that you can do. Another trick that I used to do, and I learned this from another Amish fella, Milo, he after growing a crop of onions, there's always little onions that underperform, and you have these very small little onions in your field. He would save those until the next year as his own onion sets. Now, when you're buying in onion sets, first of all, they're not approved for certified organic growing because they have a growth inhibitor on them. So that's one thing. But when you're buying onion sets, the seed companies won't ship them to you until the danger of freezing is over. So you can't get them until, like, say, later April, early May, or even a little bit later, depends on the season. But if you saved your own onions from the previous year, and say you do that solar tarp technique that David Kohlmeyer was showing us there in a slideshow, you can get those onions into the ground quite early, because you can get them before the other onions are shipped out. So you'll be the only one planting these onions. You're going to be harvesting onions earlier than anybody else. So there's another good season extension technique for a specific crop there, is just saving those very small onions that you grow to plant them out the next year. And then there's many types of greens that can overwinter. We talked about overwintering parsnips. You can also get away with overwintering carrots. I did that at my place just this past year, like for this spring, and the overwintered carrots were fresh and crisp and very tasty. The problem with overwintering carrots is you might lose the top inch or two of your carrots, might turn to complete mush. So as you're harvesting them, you got to slice that top inch off. And if you're doing that on a for-profit scale, it might eat away at your profitability for sure. But on a homesteading scale, you can get away with overwintering carrots in the ground. Salsify is another vegetable that you can overwinter in the ground. Jerusalem artichoke or sunchoke is another vegetable you can overwinter in the ground. And then here are a bunch of greens that reliably will come back the next season. You grow these in the fall, like even outside. I'm not even talking greenhouse growing. You can grow these outside in your garden in the fall, have a harvest of rapini greens, and then the next year it'll grow back in those little florets. And then corn salad, also known as mosh, also known as felt salad in German, has many different names because it's very popular green, is a very, very cold, hardy, dependable green that you can grow outside, like not even in a greenhouse. You can grow them outside and it'll come back again in the spring. Claytonia, which is also known as miner's lettuce, is another one. Chicory is another green. Chard and kale is a little bit iffy in this area. Sometimes it overwinters, sometimes it doesn't. But there are many different types of greens that do overwinter in your garden. Radicchio is another one. Parsley is another one. They'll all overwinter in your garden. Now in the middle of winter, you have all these beets in storage, or all these turnips in storage, or all these radish in storage. And sometimes you can take them out of storage and then just lay them out onto your basement floor, is what I used to do. And then they'll start to sprout greens out of the top of the beets, out of the turnips, out of the radish. And then you just go back in there and you harvest those greens. And those greens are quite nice. I used to sell those to a chef for premium. And you can force greens in the middle of winter sometimes by using some of these root vegetables that you have in storage. You can bring them out in the middle of winter and just kind of change your environment from their cold cellar conditions to just your basement floor conditions, is what I used to do. And it was enough to make them sprout, and I was able to harvest greens, and then I was able to sell the greens at a premium. And then likewise, just growing under stacks of fluorescent lights near my wood stove, I would do pea shoots and sunflowers, and I'd bring that to market in the middle of winter. And so I'd have fresh greens in a variety of ways there at my market stand in the middle of winter. And there are even greens that you can grow in the dark. Corn and corn shoots, which end up being like literally sugar sweet. You can grow those in the dark and they end up being like this pale yellow green. And they look quite nice and they're very sweet. Pea shoots you can grow in the dark too, and they end up being, instead of dark green, they're this very pale yellow kind of green. And they get sweeter as well being grown in the dark. But there are greens that you can grow in the middle of winter indoors without taking up much space, with just a little bit of setup. You just grow them straight up in racks, like even a baking rack will do. And you can grow greens in the middle of winter, and that's a great thing to bring to market for sale. And it's a great thing if you're a homesteader to feed yourself in the middle of winter too. And so, yeah, these are other tricks to get an early jump here. Oh, this here is another trick we used to use. This is back when we were using that black plastic in the fields. We would make a couple of black plastic beds in the fall and never plant them. They would just be there for as soon as the snow melts in the spring. That black plastic would heat up early, and we were able to get crops in there earlier. And so we would purposely put these black plastic beds in the fall, so we can plant in early spring. Solarizing field patches, that was David Kohlmeyer's example. Low tunnels in the field, that was that Schneid example that we were using with that perforated low tunnel plastic. Row cover, we already talked about. Overhead watering systems. I mentioned that example about strawberries that got a late frost on them and lost all the blossoms. What my father-in-law used to have set up back when he used to grow conventional strawberries is he would have a watering system that was set up to a thermometer. And if the temperature dipped below freezing, his overhead sprinkler would come on. And that overhead sprinkler, leaving that on overnight as the temperature dipped to that frost kind of stage, was enough to keep frost off of them. And so an overhead watering system can keep late frost off of a crop, which is very handy if you're a strawberry grower. And it's also effective not only in the early spring, it's also effective in late fall. Cold frames and hot frames, we talked about those in the greenhouse management lecture there, about the difference between there, and that's another way to get an early jump on your season. Passive greenhouses with heat sinks, we talked about that with David. Double greenhouses, we talked about that with Elliot Coleman, but Chickabiddy also does that too. And then proper greenhouses that are wired, heated, plumbed, and all that kind of stuff. We already covered that. And then on the opposite end, tricks for a long finish to your market garden. Many of these tricks are the same as the spring in order to get that season extension. So here's something I want to talk about though. And I mentioned this before, growing vegetables into the late fall is different than growing in the early spring, mostly because of that daylight hours. That fall equinox, usually around September 22nd, messes with plants. At that fall equinox, your nights are going to become longer than your days, and then that signals for plants to go to seed because all they want to do is reproduce. So as I mentioned before, I try to time it so vegetables are mature for in and around or just later than that fall equinox. And then after that, they hold in the field remarkably well. So got to keep that in mind when you're growing vegetables into the late fall. Here at the very end here, I have lists of non-related growing season extension ideas that we've covered. And then growing related season extension ideas are also listed here. Many of those. And then David Kohlmeyer's season extension slideshow is also summarized here. I know I'm going through these quick, but we're running out of time here. And I just want to make you know that they're available here on the slideshow. If you ever want to go back and get any of these lists of season extension techniques, they're all right here for you. And I think that's it. 11:03, that's not so bad. Wrap that up in time. Any questions from you guys before we wrap up our season extension technique talk? All right, I think we're wrapping. See you guys on farm in another hour and a half or so.
Thanks, Mark.
See you, fellas.
Hey, Mark, how did everybody come pick up their CSA?
I have only seen under one sky here this morning. I haven't seen like any individuals or whatnot. Don't take it personally. There's always somebody or another that doesn't pick up their CSA for whatever reason. And here at Hayes Farm, being a community nonprofit farm, I think some folks sign up to our CSA because they want to support us, and the vegetables are kind of secondary, you know, to each their own. And by the end of the week, like I said, I really stay on top of that cooler, and anything that's left over either gets divided amongst us or used in our seasonal eating class or donated to the Salvation Army.
Italy. Thank you, Mom.
All right, folks, we'll see you back on farm.